racism has impacted us in terms of the military, not the military, but the prison industrial complex. And our brother Bryan Stevenson, who founded the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, puts it this way. He said, slavery hasn't ended, it has evolved. Now, Desmond Tutu has named Bryan Stevenson the Nelson Mandela of America. He said, if we will pay attention and go to school on what Bryan Stevenson has to teach us, then we can get at what ails us in this country about race, and to put it in Bryan's terms, slavery not ending, but evolving. Now, it occurs to me that before we get back to Dr. Gillespie, that I want to give a little commercial here for the book that we are inviting you to read during Lent, called The Cross and the Lynching Tree. James Cone, just died last year, was the professor of religion, and he was at Union Theological Seminary in New York City. He was responsible for inventing black theology. And what he did was take a look, an in-depth dive at the philosophy and theology of Martin Luther King Jr. and the theology and philosophy of Malcolm X. And he found in the bringing of those two together the nexus of what he calls black liberation theology in America. He wrote several books. One very strong book is Malcolm and Martin. This book is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And he said, whereas white people have one view of the cross that really doesn't impact them on a day-to-day basis, other than their personal problems, the personal crosses that we bear. He said, African American folks have that appropriation of the cross in terms of personal crosses they bear, but also that for a significantly embarrassing, shameful, evil amount of time during Jim Crow years, until the determination that segregation was illegal, we had these lynchings where people would come by the thousands and have picnics and take pictures and all of that. Well, he unpacks all of that in a very important way. And I really think it's a very important book. Now I'm gonna show you how my brain goes on all sorts of... It's gonna culminate on the Saturday before Palm Sunday with a pilgrimage to Montgomery to visit the Equal Justice Initiative. And the establishment of two very important institutions there in Montgomery by Bryan Stevenson. One is a memorial about lynching, and the other is a civil rights museum. And so, clearly that will be capped. We're going to take two buses, and we're going to fill it with a mix of All Saints Atlanta people and St. Luke's Atlanta people. And we're going to be going back and forth between those two venues to have a study of the cross and the lynching tree. Now, all of that brings me back to Dr. Andra Gillespie. So she has been studying the political scene, and particularly how it impacts African Americans in America. And one of the things that I hope that she and I can get to, we're going to start with her appearance on NBC and unpack that and talk about income disparity and how the partial government shutdown impacted our brothers and sisters here in Atlanta and throughout the country. But she also is a deeply religious person herself. And on one of the YouTubes that I saw, she was talking about the scene. This person knows the political scene. And you can't look at the political scene in the United States without taking a look at the phenomenon of right-wing conservative evangelicals. I'm talking about the extreme right wing, okay? And how there is a kind of a cult nature that looks like it has more to do with power than it does with the humility of Jesus, the peacemaker who came in on the humble donkey on Palm Sunday. And she quotes her mother in this YouTube, and she says, when she hears these people who don't sound or feel like Jesus, she said, Jesus needs a better PR man. Now, I really like that. I like the call for you and me to understand that we are PR agents for Jesus. There are a lot of people in this country, and the largest bubble of them is in the millennial group, who are embarrassed by Jesus and for whom the word Christianity is a turnoff. Well, they don't know, obviously, the Jesus you and I know and the Jesus that we love. They don't know Jesus as a love-based person, but rather Jesus as a fear-based person. And we who know that, this is the essence of evangelism. I've been called to speak to the evangelism ministry here at St. Luke's soon. And that's what we're going to talk about, is what is the PR, okay? Now, I think, I hope she's going to be here in 5 minutes, and we'll get into her. But it occurs to me to see, do you all have some questions that here we're going to have an expert in the political scene looking at it from the perspective of structural racism, knows from the inside out about African Americans as candidates and this poor PR for Jesus. Are there any questions that you are bringing to this that you want to make sure that I propose to her? And my friend Elizabeth is going to bring you a wireless microphone, and we'll get your questions. If your heart's beating fast, that means the Holy Spirit wants you to speak right now. Is there a question that occurs to you all? All right, I'm going to look at my notes while you are thinking about all that. There's one. There's another one. Elaine? Thank you for standing.
Thank you for observing that I'm standing. I think that all of us probably understand that budgets are all about values. What I would love to hear the professor speak to is how can we as private citizens in Georgia influence what is developed as our state budget? How can we have a say in that? How can we move our budget makers so that our budget in the state reflects common values?
Sounds great. Thank you. So budget is, and there was a question, there was a hand back there, I thought. There you go. Thank you.
Hi. Yeah, I wanted to, my question is about the relationship of institutional...
Bring it up like an ice cream cone. Thank you.
Okay. My question is about the relationship of institutional racism and the cost of labor and the investment that we all have as consumers in cheap labor and our fears of a release of that.
Very good. Institutional racism and labor costs. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now love and energy is flowing like a river.
We've got another. My question would be to ask her to speak about the hierarchy of the pecking order at the state capitol, because you not only have the racial distinctions, but there are also some very strong misogynistic tendencies by the primary white males in power, so that there is a layer of that as well at the Capitol, and I think she could very well speak to it.
Excellent. Wow. Very good. We're talking about hardball questions today, aren't we? Thank you. Neil, it's coming to you.
I would like to ask her or you, in the evangelical community, how much the anti-abortion movement is fueling the conservative evangelical fundamentalist Christian movement, and to the extent how that negatively affects, in a way, the proclamation of the gospel. Not that being pro-choice is the gospel, but
Right.
how do we interplay between those two?
Sounds great. Who else? Please. Thank you.
My question would be about, oftentimes we hear about engagement of the African American voter, and that also seems to distinguish itself across racial lines within the Democratic Party and getting the vote out. If there's an African American candidate, there seems, from what the media tells us, more of a push, and African Americans will show up at the voting block. But if it tends to fall in another racial category, they say the vote doesn't get out. There's no show up, and we have to push to get voters to show up at the polls. So I would like for her to speak to that, how we can be more inclusive and engage everyone and get across the racial lines that seem to be even infiltrating within our candidates in our political system.
Now, are you talking about voter suppression, or are you talking about voter turnout?
Well, kind of both, but voter
Both.
turnout more
Okay.
so.
Okay, great, very good. Thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Will you all help me remember? Ray, did you have? You know, I did have a birthday that week last week. Thank you.
Happy birthday.
Thanks, Ray.
So we all know in this room that there's a huge opportunity disparity gap in Atlanta. So how do we teach people more about white privilege? Because I think it's, you know, there's such denial of just that fact. So I think educating the power structure on that would be so helpful.
Sounds great. Thank you. I hope you all brought your sleeping bags, because I think we're going to stay a couple of weeks here for this seminar, Neil. Great questions. Anybody else? Okay.
Oh,
Yes.
there we go.
Thank you.
I'm not even sure what the question is, but I'm sitting here thinking about Latinos and how I want them to be included in this conversation.
So that
Latinos, the
Latino.
Latino community, I think that particularly right now, there's such, I think from the present administration on down, there's a disdain, a marked disdain for Latinos, and it really, really hurts me.
Got it.
Yeah.
Very good. Wonderful array of questions. Are y'all praying that she's almost here? And I mean, you're doing your work, right, as prayerful people. Yeah, very good. But this is good.
Well, I had a question for you, Ed.
Oh,
All
great.
right. I just thought you could speak a little bit more about how you see this branch of the church becoming a PR agent. The right wing is very
About, and we can go ahead and explore this. What about our being a better PR agent for the issues that we think are Jesus issues? And just a theological word, whenever we talk about Jesus and Jesus values, we have to remember that there are all sorts of strains of theology in the Hebrew scriptures and the Christian scriptures, okay? I rather prefer to call it Hebrew scriptures than Old Testament, because it feels kind of Christian supremacist and to do that. So I shy away from that. So given that there are all sorts of strains in Hebrew scriptures, let's understand that Jesus chose to identify with one of those strains primarily. On his inauguration day, it was not engraved, come and see Jesus ordained to the rabbinate, but it was the first day he went to preach in the synagogue in his hometown, and of all the scrolls that he could have chosen, he chose the scroll of Isaiah and read from Isaiah 51. which comes into the Christian scriptures at Luke 4:18, which is, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and he has anointed me to proclaim good news, and to a variety of categories of humanity that are on the margins and who are underserved and who receive bigotry, in effect. So Jesus was a prophet, and so in order for us to be, we can't abandon the prophetic strain of that central. Spiritualists, I'm very much a spirituality person. I have always been a spirituality person and am drawn to the mystical and all of that stuff. And that is awfully dangerous if we only dwell there and think we've represented Jesus. That's where Marcus Borg's wonderful book, Meeting Jesus Again for the First Time, where he talks about there being 5 kind of distinguishing characteristics, including being a person of prayer and mysticism, and a person who is a healer, and also a person who is a social change agent, and that the thing that Jesus said you have to seek first is the kingdom of God, or the reign of God, or God's civilization, or the way God would have it if God came in and dictated everything, which God doesn't do. Or to use Presiding Bishop Curry's language, if love had its way. So we have to promote that. And my experience has been that to the degree we lead with its being a love-based religion, not a fear-based religion, a religion that promotes unity and oneness, not separateness, and that it changes anything that is not love-structured, then we're on our way. And that means that we have to use absolutely every piece of technology that anybody else is using. That's why streaming is so important. Social media platforms are so important, on and on and on. And we have to find ways to work on our language so that people who have a younger language because of their generation cannot have to translate. So I would, if I had my way, if I were the Pope, I would say, okay, stop using churchy language. Stop using inside baseball language and find a way to translate it into scientifically oriented and other ways. Okay, there was another question.
Yes, I've got a question that may be more for you than the professor. I'm interested in the challenge of being open and curious to those who are not like us in theology, or who are more in the fear-based Christianity rather than love.
That is one of the most important questions anybody can ever pose. What about being truly, genuinely open and engaging with people who think differently than you do and come down on the other end of the political and theological spectrum than you do? And I've got a heart full of energy about this, and it has to do with making sure that we are seeing one another as human beings, not as positions on the spectrum. And if I lead with addressing you as a position on the spectrum, I've already lost. A very good example was my first time back to that church that I served in California. So I was speaking about bridging the gap and the very issue you're talking about. And after I finished, and I had really poured my heart out, this blessed white liberal lady whom I love and have known, she says, well, Ed, how do we relate to them? In a stereotypical categorizing way, you know. Well, I said, you start with finding out what their story is and what makes them tick. So one of the ways to diffuse an impasse that's a rather angry impasse in the midst of a theological or political conversation is to say, in the most artful way you can, based on the moment, and you have to kind of feel your way into the moment and intuit yourself into the moment, is can you tell me the story behind how you formed that position? And as soon as we get into our storytelling, we're in a different part of our brain than the reptilian brain, which doesn't think, it just postures into fight or flight. But that means that we have to care. We have to give a damn about what really makes that person tick. So next week, I'm going to go to South Georgia for my aunt, one of my aunt's 94th birthday. And there in Jessup, my name is not Ed, it's not even Edwin, but it's Edwin Bless His Heart. And before my mother died, I'd gone to visit her in the hospital, and one of my favorite cousins was there. And I said, you know, I'm about to retire, and I'm thinking about moving back to Jessup. And my beloved cousin, she said, bless your heart, Edwin. She said, well, we'd have to manufacture some controversies for you, wouldn't we? So playfulness is always good. I've written a book, Neil, and it's called 8 Habits of Love, and it's about how you can get yourself out of the reptilian brain up into your mammalian brain and your prefrontal cortex. And there are 8 things that you can practice over and over and over again that become habits. And one of them is to make sure that you are maintaining your playfulness. Because if you're uptight all the time, you can't determine what's on the other end of your fly fishing. And if you've got so much slack in it, you can't tell whether or not you've got a bite under the surface either. So you have to have it a little taut, but not tight, and have to have a little play there. And that is really very important in having these conversations. Now, clearly, I'm talking about one-on-one, and I think that's another key, is that we have to take the time to have one-on-one relationships that are playful and that are narrative-based and are not clenched fist, I know you and you're kind, and I'm ready for you with all of my arguments. Bishop Tutu says that his father always told him, Desmond, you must improve your argument, not raise your voice in your argument. And when we feel that we're getting a little more strident and a little louder, there's some domestic moments happening right over here. I just feel a little domestic moment happening right here. He said, you have to improve your argument. So that's another thing. And then one last thing. You are calling for, usually the word multiculturalism, which is a very dear word to me, is invoked about race, having difference in race. But it's actually having difference in culture. And culture is how truth and beauty are determined. And so people who have a different perspective than you do are coming from a different culture than you are. And in order to have a multicultural environment, we want to have a multicultural church here at St. Luke's. We want the tent to be big with a lot of different opinions. Then you have to understand that you're going to have to take time and keep kind of going into spiral circles, usually, hopefully, going into the depths of love and respect. Not the same thing. But if you've got plowing on through, you can guarantee that is a monocultural experience. So we can't plow through with somebody with whom we disagree. We've got to pay enough respect to take time. Please.
Ed, I was trying to keep up with you. You mentioned story. Someone tell their story. Unfortunately, we take one story and make that a cultural experience. We need many stories before we have a cultural experience.
That is so crucial. There's been a study done at Harvard Leadership School or something. Yum, you know Harvard. Anyway, they got a leadership government, the Harvard Government School or something. John F. Kennedy. Anyway, they did a study about exactly what you're talking about. And said, you have to have multi-narratives. You have to have a lot of narratives that come together, and not everybody has to subscribe to the same narrative. So let's get back to Jesus here. There's not one Jesus. And the way we know that there's not one Jesus is because we got 4 Gospels. Matthew and Mark and Luke and John could not agree. So what do religious people do? All go off and get them another church. And so they founded another church. And they said, okay, so we literally study in graduate school the Matthean Jesus, Matthew's Jesus, the Lucan, the Markan, and the Johannine Jesus. And then even in there, we've got a lot of texture because we've got about 3 levels of editing going on. And some of the stuff that they say Jesus says in the Gospels, Jesus didn't say. The 3rd generation had to stitch together some stories, and they made it up. So, yes.
I don't know if this fits into what Dr. Gillespie gets to talk about, but listening, one of the reasons I like coming to this place is because I feel like it equips me to think and deal with complexity. And I'm in no way insulting anyone who doesn't want that in their lives, but I think in our political narrative, there are a number of people who are not in a space where complexity is helpful or sustaining or nourishing to them. And I don't know how to find, I hear what you're saying, but I turned to Leslie and said, well, the idea that there's more than one Jesus is just so inflammatory to some people, that the idea that it needs to be clear with rules and a way to get ahead and work toward what you need, and this idea that getting things complex, I feel like that politically is also just upsetting to people. They want it to be direct and right. And how do we get across those 2 spaces?
That's so important. I hope you all heard that. The echoes in here, but yeah. What we're talking about right now is complexity. And you didn't use the word nuance, but there's a lot of nuances in what we're talking about. Oh, great. And so oftentimes people who are coming from a very strident, locked down position don't want to deal with the complexities because that's uncomfortable. So let me bring up now, and Dr. Gillespie, hi, welcome. We're talking about conservatives and liberals having conversations, the whole multiculturalism applying to race, ethnicity, class, and also being on the spectrum. And this is my last thing I'm going to say, and then I'm going to welcome you. And that is that oftentimes people who don't want that kind of complexity and nuance in their lives really are afraid. Which gets me back to the narrative. It's really important in order to connect with somebody whose politics and theology is fear-based, is to try to engage them in a conversation that lowers the anxiety. And not until a person lives in an arena where the anxiety is pretty doggone low so that their brain actually can come up into the mammalian brain and actually think, are we going to, and there's some really strong, unfortunate things being written right now about cultism, where you submit yourself to being re-traumatized. So, with that, would you all please welcome my newest best friend, Dr. Andra Gillespie. Welcome. So good to have you. So you've already been to church?
Yes. Sorry, we were running a little late today.
Did y'all have good church?
Yes.
All right. So you're full of the Spirit and ready to go. So I've been telling them about why I was so attracted to you, seeing you on TV, and that you said some things that I should have thought about. After you explained it, I said, oh, of course. The shutdown did impact people disproportionately based on race, ethnicity, a lot of other things. So, and we've told them about your pedigree. I didn't tell you she went to Yale, and she's been at Emory for several years. And now she's going to illumine us. So we have also been wanting to know what you thought about a lot of the other issues in our whole political culture, in terms of this tribalism that we have and the lack and the cutoff that we're experiencing. We also want you to talk a little bit about misogyny in Washington, D.C., if you've seen or heard anything about that. Okay. And in addition to the race, because we talked about Barack Obama and Cory Booker. So let me stop and let you talk. Hi.
Hi,
Welcome.
how are you? Good, well, thank you for staying.
Can you hear?
Coming early, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's going to have to treat it as a...
Can you hear me
screen.
now? All right, better.
Yeah.
So my name is Andra Gillespie. I am an associate professor of political science at Emory University, where I also direct the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference. My research interests are in African American political leadership, so I've been writing for the last 10 years about black politicians, largely born after the Civil Rights Movement, but who came of age after the Civil Rights Movement, and how their campaign styles tend to differ from those who preceded them. And I was particularly interested in the starts of their political careers, where you have younger black politicians challenging older black politicians for power. So that's led me around the path of writing a couple of books, one about Cory Booker, and then a brand new one about Barack Obama, and looking at what he actually was able to deliver to African American communities.
Good deal.
Yeah.
So let's just go back to that TV appearance, and let's talk about the shutdown and its impact, please.
So I was asked by 11 Alive to answer some questions about how the shutdown would disproportionately impact African Americans. And I think it's really important to sort of understand sort of the context of how racial inequality manifests itself in socioeconomic differences that we can't attribute to personal factors, but that actually tend to be structural in their origin. So just sort of as a history, I think most people kind of understand intuitively based on what they observe, even in a city like Atlanta, that African Americans tend to be disproportionately more socioeconomically disadvantaged than their white counterparts. And there are lots of reasons for that have their origins in slavery. So, I know not every white person in America, has been here since the Mayflower, or who can trace their ancestry and lineage back to the Mayflower. But there are certain structural disadvantages that came as a result of slavery. And so if people had, generations upon generations of opportunity to be able to develop wealth, and you have a group that, up until the mid-1860s was in chattel bondage, then that's going to put them at a disadvantage relative to those who can trace their lineage back to the founding of our country, or who came earlier. And even still beyond that, for those who you could say have come more recently to the United States, there are still structural disadvantages which also are going to disadvantage African Americans, even if their families have actually been in the United States for longer periods of time. So if we could look at sort of the creation of black codes, we could look at race riots in the early part of the 20th century. So we could look at Tulsa, Oklahoma. We could look at Auburn Avenue, actually, and look at the Atlanta race riot. A lot of the origins of those riots were economic in nature, where sort of the main black thoroughfares for business and sort of where you see black commercial activity sort of happening in their fullest, those are places that get targeted in some of these riots. And so because of that, that's actually going to make it harder for people to be able to build wealth. Then if we think about other policies that emerged, during the New Deal and in the immediate post-war period. So whether it was black occupations like domestic work and farm labor being initially written out of Social Security provisions, or whether we're talking about redlining with FHA loans that actually sort of privileged suburban enclaves for FHA loans, where it actually disadvantaged and actually wouldn't provide housing loans for townhouses, for instance, or for urban dwellings that didn't have yards and didn't have detached houses. And those were places that African Americans tended to live, which meant that their communities didn't get that influx of federal dollars, which meant that their housing prices didn't fall. And then we could talk about the late 1960s, where we see blacks moving into communities and you see whites moving out very quickly. Then market forces take over and those houses just don't appreciate at the same rate. And so even where we have income equality, which is actually on average not true along racial lines, but even in places where we could have income equality, chances are at the same income levels and at the same educational levels, you're going to have lower levels of wealth amongst African Americans because they just have not had the time, nor have they been given the same types of advantage to be able to accrue that type of net worth, which means that in the longer term, when you have something like a shutdown happen, or when you have, somebody get sick, that means that you have less of a safety net, less of a cushion to fall back on during these time periods. I think it's also important to keep in mind that the reason why this affected African American workers disproportionately is because historically, government employment has actually been the key or the pathway for blacks to actually enter the middle class. There tended to be more provisions there. There tended to be more oversight to try to prevent discrimination once those provisions started to be put into place. And so blacks are actually disproportionately employed by the federal government as well. I don't have the state figures, but they're actually more likely to be employed by state and local government as well. And so people look at that, they look at the relative job security of government employment and say, well, they should be set, they should be fixed. But there are a couple of caveats to that. One, if you work for the government, especially if you're highly skilled, your income trajectory is actually going to be less than if you kind of took the risk of going into the private sector and dealing with certain types of things. And then you have these things happen like government shutdowns, or you could potentially have, entire categories of jobs actually end up sort of being subject to, being dismissed. So civil service protection can only get you so far. If they decide that your job title is no longer needed, they can get rid of an entire job category and you would still lose your job.
Wow, and in light of its time, I'm going to introduce one other thing that you and I didn't talk about on the phone, but a lot of this goes down without interruption from democracy, because democracy seems to be deteriorating these days in light of a lot of white right-wing religious expressions that want to put up a barrier against immigrants, people of color in general, people who don't have money, et cetera, et cetera. And I know that you, I saw this video that you were talking about, Jesus needs a better PR first. Can you talk a little bit about how what you've just described gets aggravated by a scene in America? Let me just stop there.
So I should acknowledge.
Oh yeah, thank you.
Like this?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Oh, okay then. All right. Is this better?
Much better.
Okay. So, so first I should acknowledge I'm evangelical. So, like when I say this, I'm critiquing my own community when we're thinking about this. So I think that there are a number of things to think about. I think, there are some perceptions about what's the difference between theocracy and democracy. And that line gets blurred oftentimes. And so there are ways that you might run a congregation versus how you would run a country. And I don't know if everybody is actually on the same page about what that stuff looks like.
We're fully democratic here at the Episcopal Church.
And so, and I think there probably needs to be more education about what the First Amendment means. That means that we can have a robust debate where people of goodwill can disagree and have honest and open dialogue about really important hot button issues. But that First Amendment, and especially the free exercise clause, in terms of sort of how you live your life and your worldview, also means that I have to be open to people choosing to live their lives and choosing to worship and live in ways that I might find simple. And that also means that they have to respect the way that I choose to live as well. And I don't think we have a robust discussion about those things. When it comes to thinking about how the religious right in particular conceives of issues like inequality, I think a lot of it is willful ignorance. Right? I think there are a lot of things. I think if I were to go to my own church and actually say the thing that I just said about income inequality and wealth inequality, it would be news to some people, and then there would be people who would argue with me about why I was wrong. And so I think that it's trying to penetrate that's actually the challenge. going forward, is to get everybody on the same page and working with the same set of facts. Because I think a lot of people really haven't interrogated their privilege in understanding that, no, you didn't get there by yourself, and there were perhaps some rules that actually sort of made it easier for you to get something that somebody else didn't get. And when I think about sort of like the redemption process and that process of sanctification, I think that there are places where there are a lot of people who have just not let God touch their hearts in particular ways, to sort of say that, you're thinking about rules when you're talking about sort of, immigrants coming over, but you didn't think about how your ancestors didn't have the same rules, about how it was easier, or how people are just playing fast and loose with rules and not actually applying the rules that exist. So if we think about asylees, for instance, right? So the idea of, are we following the protocols that are actually in place to actually take seriously the claims that people are making, as opposed to just like crying caravans and just kind of setting people off. So I don't necessarily know if people are actually applying their faith in that setting. I think actually they're checking their faith and they're letting their personal interests, which are racist, actually inform their positions, and sometimes they try to put the imprimatur of God on it after the fact. But like, there's no way that you can make up for that, right? That you're just being racist, and Jesus had nothing to do with that.
So it's 11, and choir people are going to be coming in just a second for the 11:15, and just talk about intervention. So I think we have a general understanding of our scene. What have you found to be effective interventions into the income disparity, into the polarization of the country?
So, I don't know if there's an intervention. I can look at survey data where I can look at Trump voters, for instance, and Clinton voters, and I can look at differences in perception. And so there's some stuff that everybody agrees on in terms of racism and misogyny. So I think most people know you shouldn't call people racial slurs. Most people know that you shouldn't, and almost everybody has agreed on the fact that you shouldn't try to, physically attack somebody on account of their identity. I think most people know that, especially when you're dealing with women, that, you shouldn't call them certain names, that there's certain things. But when we ask questions about, is this racist or sexist, and we start pointing out less obvious things that might be more structural, like, is it racist to, poison the water someplace, or to put landfills in poor communities? Is it sexist to, not allow nursing mothers to have, places where they can nurse their babies at work? That's where you get more variation, right? And so I think the realization or the intervention is to understand the differences between obvious forms of racism and sexism, and then structural stuff. And that's often where we see differences. And so some of those differences can kind of map somewhat neatly over partisan differences as well, in terms of sort of who cares about systemic issues versus who cares about the interpersonal. So I think, most people would sort of at least pay lip service to the gains of the Civil Rights Movement. They understand the Voting Rights Act needed to happen, the Civil Rights Act needed to happen, segregation was bad. The difference is that there's some people who want to stop in 1965 or 1968 if we want to throw the Fair Housing Act into effect and say, well, anything else that happens, that's just some interpersonal stuff, and we can't legislate that. And there are some things, like even with all the best laws in the world, there are going to be some bigots who you're never going to be able to reach. And so there is some truth to that. But then there are some people who are saying, okay, now that we're 50 years past that, and we still see certain types of inequalities, let's go back through the rules and figure out what rules, what processes, what practices are still in place that actually has state sanction, that are actually still disproportionately affecting certain types of people more than others. And there's some folks who just want to stop in the 60s and say, but we did all that already, right? Jim Crow is gone. And I think we're still having that conversation, right? And so it's really hard to sort of convince people that, yeah, no, it didn't all end with Martin Luther King, and that we really have to do more. And I think it's in part because it's harder to detect, it hits closer to home. And sometimes people might have to give up certain types of advantages, which is why I think we see the type of resistance that we do today.
Professor Gillespie, this is a start.
Yes.
Okay, of a conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Andra Gillespie. That was just right. Oh, sorry, I had to come late, but